The winter wind howling through the snow-dusted forests of Western Europe in late 1944 carried with it a sound that had struck terror across the continent for half a decade. The deep, rhythmic squeal of wide steel tracks, the low, throaty rumble of a Maybach 512 engine. For the German Panzer commander standing in the cupola of his Panther tank, wrapped in heavy wool against the biting cold, there was a profound sense of invulnerability. He was commanding 45 tons of sloped Krupp steel, a machine built to dominate, designed with a singular, ruthless philosophy, to outrange, outgun, and out-armor anything the Allies could drag across the Atlantic Ocean. To the German High Command, armored warfare was an exact science, and the heavy tank was its ultimate, terrifying expression. They had built steel cathedrals on tracks, formidable, imposing, perfect. But out there, hidden in the freezing fog, something was waiting for them. It didn't roar like a heavy tank. It didn't slowly lumber into a textbook firing line. It sat idling, low to the frozen ground, humming with the nervous, high-pitched energy of an aircraft engine. And when it struck with a violent, blinding speed that defied every rigid rule of armored warfare the Germans had ever written. Before the Panther's gunner could even begin to swing his massive gun to return fire, the Shadow had already fired its high-velocity shell, slammed into reverse, and vanished back into the tree line at nearly 60 miles per hour, leaving the German crew in burning wreckage, and leaving the German generals in a state of absolute, bewildered rage. They hadn't just been beaten, they had been insulted. Their multi-million Reichsmark marvels of engineering were being systematically hunted down and gutted by a machine that the German military elite considered a complete joke. A vehicle with armor so thin, an angry infantryman with an armor-piercing rifle round could crack it. A vehicle with absolutely no roof to protect its crew. A cheap, mass-produced hot rod built by an American car company. The M18 Hellcat. This is not just the story of a fast vehicle. This is the story of a fatal clash between two entirely different ways of looking at the world. A story of how a doctrine of pure, practical survival humiliated a doctrine of mechanical delusion. To understand the bitter shock of the German command, we have to look closely at the mechanical obsession that ultimately crippled them. By the late stages of the war, the German Panzerwaffe was fighting on the defensive. Their answer to an overwhelming world was simply to build thicker walls. The Tiger, the Panther, the King Tiger, they became obsessed with static superiority. Thick, sloped armor that could bounce enemy shells, massive, long-barreled guns that could kill from miles away. But in their pursuit of the ultimate defensive weapon, they sacrificed the very thing that had won them their early victories: mobility. The Panther tank was a masterpiece of lethal geometry, but it was a machine that often defeated itself before it ever saw combat. Look at its wheels. German engineers designed a highly complex, interleaved suspension system, row after row of overlapping steel wheels. On a drafting table, it was brilliant. It distributed the tank's massive 45-ton weight beautifully, providing a smooth ride for the gunner. But wars are not fought on drafting tables. They are fought in the freezing mud of Western Europe. During the day, the Panther would churn through deep, wet mud. The mud would pack tightly into the gaps between those dozens of overlapping wheels. And at night, when the temperature plummeted below freezing, that mud turned into solid blocks of ice. When the German crews woke up the next morning, their tanks were completely immobilized. They had to spend hours with blowtorches, desperately trying to thaw out their own suspension just to get the tracks to move. And if the ice didn't stop them, their own engines would. The German engineers had placed a 45-ton tank on a final drive system originally designed for a 30-ton vehicle. The immense strain was simply too much. The gears in the Panther's transmission would routinely shatter under the stress. A brand new Panther, fresh from the factory, had a final drive lifespan of roughly 150 miles before it catastrophically failed. They were majestic beasts, but they were fragile. They spent more time waiting for mechanics than fighting. While the Germans were building heavier, increasingly temperamental steel boxes, the Americans were looking at the battlefield through an entirely different lens. General Leslie J. McNair, the architect of American ground forces, looked at the sprawling battlefields of Europe and made a controversial decision. He decreed that American tanks, like the Sherman, were not meant to fight other tanks. They were infantry support. They were meant to break lines, exploit gaps, and keep moving. If heavy enemy armor appeared, you didn't send a tank to fight a tank. You sent a dedicated hunter. A tank destroyer. McNair's doctrine demanded a vehicle that was reactive, aggressive, and above all, fast. It didn't need to survive a hit because its entire philosophy was based on not getting hit in the first place. The task of building this specialized hunter didn't go to a traditional military arsenal. It went to Detroit. Specifically, the Buick Motor Division of General Motors. Harlow Curtis, the brilliant executive running Buick, didn't look at the project as a military burden. He looked at it as an engineering challenge. He threw open the gates of the massive General Motors proving grounds in Milford, Michigan. The engineers at Buick didn't build a tank. They built a race car with a cannon. They threw out heavy armor entirely. They gave the hull a maximum thickness of just half an inch, 12.7 millimeters. To power it, they didn't use a sluggish diesel truck engine. They dropped in a Continental R975, a 9-cylinder radial aircraft engine. The exact same powerhouse used in airplanes, producing 400 horsepower. They ditched the nightmare of overlapping wheels and mounted it all on a revolutionary torsion bar suspension system with independent shock absorbers. It was a system that allowed the vehicle to violently glide over rough, muddy terrain at top speed without throwing its tracks or snapping the spines of its crew. The result was the M18 Hellcat. It could hit 60 miles per hour on a paved road. It could accelerate, brake, and change direction with a violence that left German gunners tracking empty air. But to achieve this extreme weight reduction, Buick and the Army planners made a decision that horrified traditionalists. They left the top of the turret completely open. No roof. The 5 young men inside were exposed to the elements. Freezing rain, blistering sun, falling artillery shrapnel, and the terrifying threat of enemy grenades dropped from upper-story windows. The German military elite laughed at this crude, open-top design. To them it was primitive, barbaric even, a sign that the Americans didn't know how to build proper armored vehicles. But they were wrong. Sometimes the greatest weapon isn't a mindless fortress that imprisons men in steel arrogance. It's the one willing to give 20-year-old boys the power to run, the room to make mistakes, so they have a chance to survive and fight another day. That open top wasn't a flaw. It was a lifeline. It gave the American commander an unobstructed 360-degree view of the battlefield. While German commanders were peering through narrow, fogged-up glass periscopes, half blind to the world around them, the Hellcat commander had his head out, eyes wide, listening to the woods, spotting the ambush, long before the heavy tank ever knew what was happening. The open top meant the crew could instantly vent the suffocating, toxic cordite smoke from the massive 76mm cannon. And most importantly, if the worst happened, if the vehicle caught fire, those boys could vault over the side and escape the burning wreck in 3 seconds flat, rather than being trapped inside a sealed steel tomb. The men who crewed these machines were a different breed entirely. They belonged to the tank destroyer battalions, and they cultivated a unique, highly aggressive culture. Their official logo was a black panther crushing a tank in its jaws. Their motto was "Seek, Strike, and Destroy." They did not view themselves as tank drivers. They viewed themselves as mechanized snipers. They spent weeks training in the art of defilade, hiding their lightweight vehicles behind the crest of a hill, so only the barrel of the gun was visible. They learned to turn off their engines, sit in the freezing mud in complete silence, camouflage their hulls with broken branches, and wait. They knew they were fragile, but they also knew they were lethal. September 1944. The rolling hills of the Lorraine region in northeastern France. For days, a heavy, suffocating blanket of fog and freezing rain had grounded American air power. The P-47 Thunderbolts, the feared tank-busting aircraft of the Allies, were stuck on the wet tarmac. General Hasso von Manteuffel, a brilliant and aggressive German armor commander, saw his opportunity. He unleashed the 5th Panzer Army, spearheaded by fresh Panther tanks, directly into the lines of George S. Patton's 3rd Army near a small town called Arracourt. The Germans were highly confident. Without American planes in the sky, they believed their heavy armor would simply crush the Allied lines in a traditional head-to-head brawl. Instead, they drove straight into an invisible meat grinder. Waiting for them in the thick pea-soup fog was the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion, and specifically a young American officer named Lieutenant Edwin Leiper. Leiper commanded a platoon of 4 M18 Hellcats. They were sitting in the damp chill near the village of Bézange-la-Petite, engines idling low, crews tense, listening to the ground vibrate. Through the whiteout, the metallic squeal of wide German tracks echoed. Then, the massive, sloping silhouette of a Panther materialized out of the mist. Then another. And another. They were dangerously close, barely 150 yards away. Here was the terrifying reality of the Hellcat crew. Their 76mm gun, as good as it was, could not reliably pierce the thick frontal armor of a Panther tank at that range. The shell would simply bounce off the sloped Krupp steel. To kill a Panther, the Hellcat had to hit it in the side, where the armor was only 40mm thick. They had to flank. Lieutenant Leiper didn't freeze. He exploited the exact doctrine his machine was built for. He gave the order. The Hellcats burst from their hiding spots, their radial engines screaming as they tore across the muddy fields, looping incredibly wide around the German formation. Inside the leading Panther, the German commander spotted the blur of movement. He screamed orders to his gunner to traverse right and return fire. And right here, in this agonizing span of seconds, the German philosophy of heavy armor completely collapsed. The Panther's turret traverse mechanism was hydraulic, powered directly by the tank's main engine. But the tank was moving slowly through the thick mud, its engine RPMs running low. Low RPMs meant a sluggish, crawling turret rotation. Frantic, the German gunner stomped on the hydraulic pedal, then grabbed the manual handwheel, cranking with all his physical strength, trying to drag tons of steel across the horizontal plane. The long barrel of the Panther swept through the fog, inch by agonizing inch. But it was too late. The M18 had already closed the distance on the flank. The American gunner acquired the side profile of the Panther. The 76mm cannon barked, a blinding flash cutting through the fog. The armor-piercing round slammed right into the side of the German tank, igniting the ammunition stored inside. The heavy Panther violently brewed up, a massive column of fire shooting out of its hatches. The moment the Hellcat fired, its driver grabbed the shifter of the advanced Torquematic automatic transmission and slammed it into reverse. He stomped the gas pedal. The suspension squatted, the engine roared, and the lightweight vehicle violently lunged backward. In a matter of 3 seconds, it had vanished completely behind a ridge. Before the surviving German crews could even process that they were swinging their guns at a ghost, the Hellcats reappeared on their other flank. Another deafening crack. Another Panther turret blown entirely off its ring. Shoot and scoot, flank and fire. This was not a battle of attrition. This was a surgical execution. Inside the cavernous steel hulls of the surviving German tanks, absolute panic took hold. These were veteran crews. They knew they were sitting in the most technologically advanced fighting vehicles on the planet. But their heavy armor was utterly useless if their enemy refused to stand in front of it. They were being systematically disassembled by machines they couldn't catch, couldn't track, and couldn't even see for more than a few seconds at a time. By the time the fog finally lifted at Arracourt, the myth of German armored invincibility lay burning in the French mud. Lieutenant Leiper's single platoon of 4 open-topped Hellcats had destroyed roughly 15 German tanks, including several top-of-the-line Panthers. The American crews sat in their open turrets, utterly exhausted. Their faces blackened with toxic cordite smoke, their ears ringing, their hands shaking uncontrollably from the sheer, terrifying adrenaline of dodging death by fractions of a second. They felt the biting cold wind. They smelled the sickening scent of burning steel and oil. And they carried the heavy psychological burden of knowing that their only armor was their own speed. Yet they did not break. That ruthless mobility, driven by the raw courage of the young men freezing inside those turrets, didn't just save American lives. It completely unraveled the German tactical playbook, shifting the momentum of the Western Front in ways the enemy never saw coming. If these untold stories of battlefield ingenuity, mechanical reality, and raw human courage bring history to life for you, please take just a single second to click the like button on this video. It's a small gesture, but it is the true engine that allows us to keep digging deep into the archives, bypassing the surface-level myths, and bringing these forgotten historical realities back into the light. Now, let's look at what was happening far behind the front lines. Because while the German tank crews were fighting for their lives in the mud of Lorraine, the German High Command in Berlin was fighting an entirely different kind of war. A war of mathematics, resources, and devastating industrial reality. When the after-action reports from Arracourt and later the Bulge finally reached the desks of the Panzer generals, it triggered a deep psychological crisis. These were men like Heinz Guderian, men who viewed tank design as an aristocratic art form. To them, a heavy tank was supposed to be a majestic beast of burden. Every Panther and Tiger was practically handcrafted. German engineers, acting more like master artisans than factory workers, would spend countless hours machining intricate road wheels. Master welders would labor over perfectly angled armor plates. Each heavy tank represented a staggering investment of the Third Reich's rapidly dwindling resources. Tens of thousands of man-hours per tank, millions of Reichsmarks, tons of rare, vital alloys like molybdenum and tungsten that Germany simply no longer possessed. And they were losing these irreplaceable masterpieces to what? A utilitarian vehicle assembled by American blue-collar auto workers in Flint, Michigan. A vehicle whose suspension components were being rapidly stamped out by the thousands on the exact same assembly lines that made Buicks for businessmen in Chicago. The generals realized with a sickening clarity that they were trapped in a fatal mathematical nightmare, even if a German gunner got lucky. Even if they managed to catch a Hellcat in the open and obliterate it with an 88mm high-explosive shell. It simply didn't matter, because for every M18 the Germans destroyed in the morning, an American Liberty ship was unloading 10 more at the docks in Normandy by the afternoon. The German High Command was bleeding its nation dry, trying to build the perfect artisanal weapon. A flawless, invincible machine of war. But out in the mud and the blood of Western Europe, perfection was being violently dismantled by good enough. Good enough, multiplied by the relentless, untouchable industrial might of the American home front. While German factories were being pounded to rubble by Allied bomber fleets, forcing slave laborers to hand-weld suspension parts in dark, damp underground caves. The Buick assembly lines in Michigan were brightly lit, running 24 hours a day, manned by workers stamping out steel and dropping in radial engines at a blistering, unstoppable pace. It was a masterclass in American pragmatism and the triumph of the assembly line. The M18 Hellcat wasn't designed to win a museum award for engineering elegance. It was a disposable, highly effective tool, built to do a very specific, very dangerous job in massive numbers. And for the proud, aristocratic officers of the Panzerwaffe, there was no greater humiliation. To have your life's work, your deeply held armored doctrine, torn to pieces not by a superior, heavier tank, but by an inexpensive, open-topped hot rod driven by a farm boy from Iowa or a mechanic from Brooklyn. They had brought a beautifully crafted, bespoke broadsword to the battlefield. The Americans brought 1 million cheap, razor-sharp scalpels and bled them to death. By the spring of 1945, the vast steel cathedrals of the German army lay in ruins, rusting quietly in the ditches and fields across Europe. The war was over. The delusion of static heavy armor had failed. Today, the M18 Hellcats share a similar silent fate. Their massive Continental aircraft engines no longer roar. Their thin steel hulls sit motionless under the sterile fluorescent lights of military museums, or weather away slowly in silent memorial parks in small towns across America. They are just cold, inanimate artifacts of a bygone era. But the machines were never the true heart of this story. Machines will always eventually rust. Engines will seize. Steel, no matter how thick, will eventually crack. What remains unbreakable is the spirit of the young men who climbed into those open turrets. These were just ordinary boys, pulled from high schools, local garages, and farmlands. They were asked to step into a paper-thin box of steel and drive directly into the gun sights of the most terrifying war machines the world had ever seen. They knew exactly what the odds were. They saw the horrific aftermath of what an armor-piercing shell could do to a human crew. They felt the freezing rain pouring down their necks, soaking their uniforms, and they knew that their only shield against sudden, violent death was their own wits, their deep trust in their crewmates, and the heavy gas pedal under their boots. Yet they pushed forward. Those terrified, incredibly brave young men are not just black and white figures in a dusty history book. For many of us watching right now, they were our fathers, our grandfathers, our uncles. The greatest chapters of American history aren't always the ones meticulously documented in the National Archives or neatly summarized in paragraphs on Wikipedia. The truest history is the one you heard in a quiet, hesitant voice across the family dinner table. It's the story of the overwhelming smell of hot oil, diesel, and cordite. The bone-chilling cold of a European winter that never quite seemed to leave their joints, even decades later. The quiet, lingering, unspoken memories of the friends who didn't get to ride the troop ships back home to New York or San Francisco. We are losing that generation of incredible men with every passing day, and when they finally go, their untold stories risk vanishing completely into the dark, lost to time forever. We cannot let those memories disappear. If your father, your grandfather, or anyone in your family served in the Second World War, whether they drove a Hellcat through the mud of France, turned a wrench in a motor pool, or carried an M1 Garand across a frozen field, please take a moment to write their story down in the comments below. Share their name. Share the unit they fought with. Share that small, incredible, seemingly insignificant memory they trusted you with on a quiet evening. Let the comment section of this video become a living, breathing memorial to them. Because long after the steel has rusted away into nothing, it is our fundamental duty to ensure that their immense courage is never, ever forgotten. Thank you for watching, and thank you for helping us keep their history alive.